Up to now, India has banned more than 300 Chinese mobile applications. While the United States is still debating whether to ban TikTok, India has outright banned multiple Chinese apps with a single decree. However, India's actions are not confined solely to the realm of software. In this video, we'll focus on India, discussing and reporting on the following topics: graveyard for foreign companies India, historical dividend period, current international situation, India benefiting from the US-China confrontation. Since 2020, India has intensified scrutiny on Chinese companies, introducing more uncertainty into their operations, with Xiaomi being a prime example. On June 12, according to Indian media reports, India's agency responsible for combating financial crimes formally notified Xiaomi's Indian subsidiary, company executives, and 3 banks on June 11, alleging illegal transfer of funds abroad and suspected violations of the Foreign Exchange Management Act. This implies that the Indian government is set to seize 55.51 billion rupees, approximately $680 million, in funds previously frozen from Xiaomi India. On June 13, media reports further stated that the Indian government demanded smartphone manufacturers like Xiaomi, Oppo, Realme, and Vivo to appoint Indian nationals as CEOs, COOs, CFOs, and CTOs in their Indian subsidiaries. This seems excessive. Generally, governments in any country do not interfere with the personnel appointments of private enterprises. Yet, Modi has openly engaged in such activities without hesitation. In recent months, the Indian government rejected a $1 billion investment in new energy vehicles from BYD, seemingly aiming to sever ties with the Chinese economy, a rare move in today's world. India has become the vanguard in suppressing Chinese companies. As neighboring countries with the world's largest populations, why is India doing this? Perhaps there's a huge strategic game behind the scenes. Whenever a major power rises on the Eurasian continent, becoming a dominant force, it leads to a unipolar situation, causing an imbalance of power on the Eurasian continent. The most typical examples include the rapid rise of Napoleonic France after the French Revolution, creating a unipolar situation in Europe and causing a power imbalance on the continent. During World War I and World War II, the rapid rise of Germany led to another unipolar situation, once again disrupting the balance of power in Europe. After the end of both world wars, the rise of the Soviet Union resulted in its dominance over the Eurasian continent, once more destabilizing the power equilibrium. Following the imbalance of power on the continent, there were no other forces that could check the rising major power. Once the land interests were nearly exhausted, the rising major power inevitably began expanding its interests into the seas, competing for maritime dominance. At this point, the strategically pressured rising land power imposes immense pressure on maritime nations, intensifying their sense of crisis. They employ a continental equilibrium strategy to counter this pressure, wholeheartedly supporting other rising land powers on the Eurasian continent to become adversaries of the rising major power, aiming to establish a new balance of power on the continent. During the Napoleonic Wars, the UK supported Tsarist Russia to become France's main opponent on the European continent, leading to the widespread outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. In World War I and World War II, the UK and the US supported Tsarist Russia, Soviet Union, making it the primary adversary of Germany on the Eurasian continent, resulting in the brutal World Wars. During the Cold War, the US and UK supported nearly all major powers on the Eurasian continent, excluding the Soviet Union, shaping the long-term Cold War of the last century. Consequently, as the power balance shifted on the Eurasian continent, with the US and UK supporting other major land powers, intense competition, either hot or cold wars, emerged on the Eurasian continent. This led to a fierce process of redistributing interests, ultimately creating historical beneficiaries who enjoyed historical dividends. Such historical dividends altered the course of a nation's history. After the Napoleonic Wars, France declined drastically, losing significant interests both on the European continent and overseas. The UK and Tsarist Russia became direct beneficiaries, with the UK becoming an empire on which the sun never sets, and Tsarist Russia serving as Europe's constable. This domination by the UK and Tsarist Russia shaped the world order before World War I, approximately 100 years prior. The UK and Tsarist Russia reaped the benefits after the Napoleonic Wars. Following the end of World War I and World War II, Germany's defeat resulted in the loss of its continental and maritime interests. The US and Soviet Union became beneficiaries, both emerging as hegemonic nations at the time, leading the world order for 46 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The US and Soviet Union enjoyed historical dividends after the two world wars. After the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union led to gains for both the US and major Eurasian countries. During the Cold War, the US invested heavily in Western European regions like Germany and Eastern Asian regions like Japan, fostering rapid development in these areas. After the Cold War, China seized historical opportunities and gained the greatest historical dividends. Its GDP share in the world swiftly soared from 1.6% in 1990 to 16.3% in 2019, fundamentally due to the Cold War dividends. With the end of the Cold War, the US became the sole global hegemon, while China ascended, shaping today's world order. The US, China, Germany, Japan, and others benefited from the historical dividends of the Cold War. This kind of historical dividend alters a country's fate, presenting immense temptation that no country should or can refuse. The outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War signifies a new power imbalance on the Eurasian continent. The Russo-Ukrainian conflict, alongside other nation-destroying wars like the Israel-Palestine conflict, fundamentally results from the beginning of a power shift on the Eurasian continent. With China curbing the major powers of the US, the foundation for such nation-destroying wars exists. It's evident that power on the Eurasian continent is thoroughly imbalanced today, with the primary sign being China's expansion into maritime territory. Currently, maritime confrontations intensify, with escalating tensions in the East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, and the Central and Northern Pacific. As the dominant naval power, the US is under significant strategic pressure due to China's rise and the imbalance of land-based powers. At this juncture, the US and UK are bound to employ a continental equilibrium strategy, aiming to support a rival power on the continent to balance against China. When China is counterbalanced, entering a strategic confrontation among land-based nations, these nations will need to amass substantial land and air forces along their borders, requiring astronomical military expenditures, causing tremendous strain on both military and fiscal resources. Consequently, China's resources supporting maritime actions will diminish, easing the maritime pressure on the US and UK. If the designs of the US and UK succeed, they, along with Japan and other major land powers, will collectively engage in a contest of military and fiscal attrition against China, a one-against-many scenario, a classic example of imbalanced strategy. Therefore, for China to rise on the Eurasian continent and engage in maritime contention, it must appropriately resolve its land disputes with India. China must not allow India to become a land-based pawn in the US and UK's continental equilibrium strategy, creating a pincer between land and sea. When the two most populous and economically potent countries, China and India, join hands, maintain friendly relations, stability prevails across the Asian continent. Both China and India, as land-based nations, have sufficient power to overlook the oceans and develop their maritime interests. Now, let's take a look at what the United States and India are up to. Over the past 6 months, Indian Prime Minister Modi and US President Biden have held numerous meetings, signing a series of defense and trade agreements covering multiple domains such as semiconductors, critical minerals, technology, space cooperation, defense cooperation, and sales, marking the start of a new era in bilateral relations. One piece of news particularly worth noting is the Memorandum of Understanding signed between US General Electric Aerospace and India's Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. Both parties will collaborate to produce engines for Indian Air Force aircraft. We know that aerospace engine technology is at the forefront and highly coveted by many major powers, and it's also very sensitive. This is a significant gift offered by the United States to India. Undoubtedly, the US hopes that India will join the continental equilibrium strategy and become a pawn on the land. Some may think this gift is substantial enough, but in reality, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Reflect on the global status of the Soviet Union after the two world wars and China's enormous economic growth and changing global status after the Cold War. You'll realize that the gift the United States is extending to India is not even close to being appetizing. India's series of actions indicate its potential desire to join the US-UK continental equilibrium strategy, aiming for the kind of massive historical dividends similar to those after the Napoleonic Wars, 2 World Wars, and the Cold War. China's objective is to dominate the oceans. However, before contending for oceanic dominance, it's imperative to dismantle the US-UK continental equilibrium strategy. One of the most crucial aspects is stabilizing Sino-Indian relations. The relationship between China and India is the cornerstone for China's maritime dominance. This is a strategic sequence. Establishing long-term friendly ties with India and working to transform the Sino-Indian border into a militarily non-confrontational boundary through mutual trust are essential goals to achieve. Then, one can enter the vast expanse of the Pacific. A stable Sino-Indian border and a stable Asian continent serve the mutual interests of both China and India. China is confident in its ability to accomplish this critical goal. This is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We genuinely appreciate your support.